Do you remember this video log from the Cerberus base in Mass Effect 3?
Grayson's brain is a mess. He must have been completely under Reaper control by the end.
And the physical enhancements?
Extremely impressive, if we could avoid having entire neural pathways rewritten in the process.
Grayson's failure was due to a lack of resolve. He wasn't loyal to anything but his next dose of red sand.
This conversation is a deep-cut reference to a main character from the novels, Paul Grayson, who is the first test subject in the experiment that led to the creation of the Cerberus soldiers in Mass Effect 3. The log makes it all sound straightforward, but Grayson's journey is much more complex and nuanced. If you were ever curious to discover Grayson's whole story, you'll find it in the novel Mass Effect Retribution. In this video, I'll tell you a bit about the book and then give recommendations on whether or not it's worth reading. For your convenience, this video is divided into chapters. The review section will contain spoilers for Retribution and some light spoilers for the Mass Effect trilogy, so watch with caution. Mass Effect Retribution is Drew Karpyshyn's third book in the series, and is a direct sequel to Ascension, continuing the stories of its main characters. It tells the story of Paul Grayson falling back into Cerberus' hands after years of evading the organization's attempts to capture him. The elusive man has a fate in store for Grayson that is much worse than a simple death, but his plans backfire. Grayson, under the influence of Reaper technology, becomes an unwilling pawn in their mission. This launches a desperate attempt to recover Grayson before he can complete the Reaper's bidding. Compelled to act based on their connection from the previous novel, Kahlee Sanders returns in Retribution to join the search for Grayson, but she has few trustworthy people to rely on to help her stay off of Cerberus' radar, forcing her to recruit the help of David Anderson. Retribution is set just after the events of Mass Effect 2 and heavily ties into the discoveries made by Shepard and Cerberus during the investigation of the Collectors. Retribution is a pretty good read. It excels at keeping the reader on the edge of their seat, and it's packed with great references to the Mass Effect trilogy, featuring quite a few of the series' most iconic characters. However, this one requires a lot of background knowledge to be fully enjoyed, making it harder to get into than the other novels in the series. That said, here are some considerations and folks I have in mind that would benefit most from picking up this novel. If you haven't read the second Mass Effect novel in the series, Ascension, I recommend holding off on reading Retribution. It builds off of the relationships and character arcs established in the previous novel, so going into it without that knowledge will make the experience much less enjoyable. Ascension is critical reading for those looking to get into Retribution, but the first novel, Revelation, is optional in my opinion. If you have read Ascension, then I'd recommend reading Retribution to get the full story of those characters. It provides a satisfying conclusion that leads into the games quite well. With that in mind, I strongly recommend reading it after a playthrough of Mass Effect 2 and before heading into Mass Effect 3. The stories are synced up in a cool way, giving readers a particularly rewarding experience for having spent their time reading these novels. Retribution is a plot-heavy book. So much happens that takes characters from one place to another. This isn't necessarily a bad thing though, as the events that transpire are pretty thrilling and kept me wondering what was going to happen next. That said, it would have been nice if this aspect of the novel was pared down a bit to prioritize exploring smaller moments with the characters. The kind of character moments I'd love to see do exist, but they are so short-lived, only occurring for a few sentences or a few paragraphs at most. Fleshing out these moments could have made relationships between characters feel much more impactful. The dynamic between Kahlee Sanders and Admiral Anderson would have benefited from this sort of attention the most. The romance between them feels too fast and not entirely earned. They have a history of feelings for each other that goes back about 20 years, but the reader has seen pretty much all of the highlights. The book does mention them meeting a handful of times between when they first met in Revelation and the events in Retribution, but it's clear that not much happened in those moments. Other than their history of knowing each other being relatively long, it's hard to see why they feel so strongly connected. Kahlee seems to develop romantic feelings for almost everyone she's had a history with, so what's so special about her and Anderson? It doesn't help that most of their relationship and attraction for each other happens in their heads. There are very brief moments where they physically display their attraction for each other, but it always feels forced and heavy-handed. I just don't buy the connection between Kahlee and Anderson they seem to think they have in this book. Another reason why this dynamic feels so awkward stems from a character issue that similarly affected Kahlee in the previous novel. Kahlee suffers from a lack of true agency. There are precious few cases where she pushes the plot along, more often being forced to follow through on the plans of other characters. There's a moment very late in the novel where Anderson is forced to make a choice between capturing a high-level Cerberus operative and saving a wounded kid. It's a really compelling scene that challenges Anderson's values and reveals who he truly is deep down. Kahlee never faces situations like this, and I really wish she did. It would make it feel like Kahlee was changed in some way by the events of the story, and it would help the reader feel more invested in her character. Despite the interaction between characters being somewhat lacking, the amount of depth characters receive within their own thoughts is pretty good, featuring some intriguing scenes of introspection from the series' best characters. One that stands out is Arya T'Loak. Arya is awesome in Retribution. She's just as intimidating and captivating as she is in Mass Effect 2 and 3, with the added bonus of being able to learn some of the secrets she hides. The reveal that Lizelle is Arya's daughter is shocking, and it makes the character's fate feel more impactful, especially after reading how much it affects Arya. Allowing the reader to access this information makes Arya more relatable in a compelling way. The Elusive Man also receives a lot of attention in the novel, giving a deeper look at the villain's inner thoughts. His ends justify the means approach is brought up throughout the story, but it has a slightly different connotation when reading it from a more intimate perspective. There are times when he expresses remorse and guilt, or at the very least, he questions his methods and what he's done. It shows a different side of him that is never seen in the games. So whenever he decides a sacrifice must be made for the greater good, it becomes more than a clever way to refresh or introduce the reader to his character. On another level, it reads as if he's constantly trying to convince himself that he's doing the right thing. It's fascinating. On the topic of Cerberus, I have to mention Retribution's elephant in the room, Kai Lang. This is the first appearance of the infamous character, and I really wish I could shake my bias of disliking him. His controversial portrayal in Mass Effect 3 lingers in my thoughts whenever I read his name on the page. It's unfortunate and somewhat unfair, but even when I distanced myself as best I could, Kai Lang is just as poor of a character in the novel as in the game. One simple way to make Kai Lang more interesting would have been to depict some fear toward the Elusive Man, something most Cerberus operatives feel. This would have paved the way for the reader to feel some empathy with Kai Lang, since we're also terrified of the Elusive Man. Instead, Kai Lang isn't afraid of anything. He stops at nothing to complete his mission, and even when it doesn't go his way, the Elusive Man doesn't even scold him. There are no personal consequences for Kai Lang's actions, and without anything at stake, he is just uninteresting to read. There are characters in the Mass Effect series who better represent the ruthless killing machine, such as Saren. In Revelation, Saren felt like an unstoppable force of nature, but he had a complexity to him that explained his perspective and rounded out his character. Kai Lang, on the other hand, lacks the qualities that would make him more interesting than the character the author desperately wants the reader to think is cool. Nearly all of the things Kai Lang does in this novel are written to be awesome and cool, but they just aren't. This is perfectly demonstrated in one of his final scenes in Retribution, where he has to make a desperate escape from Grissom Academy by literally swinging from bars on the ceiling like a monkey. This moment is earnestly trying to show off his physical prowess, but it fails spectacularly. The image is beyond hilarious and doesn't convey the desperation of his escape. It's just simply ridiculous. The last thing I want to discuss is Paul Grayson, who has some of the most interesting scenes in the entire novel. Grayson endures a harrowing journey in Retribution, beginning with the brutal experimentation and torture by Cerberus. Forcefully injecting him with red sand is so violating and gross, which is only made worse by the fact that he's slowly being turned into an indoctrinated vessel for the Reapers. Reading what it's like to be indoctrinated from a first-hand perspective is horrifying, as is the thought of being a passive observer within your own mind, being controlled by another entity and knowing there's nothing you can do about it. These sections are written with great detail, immersing us in this frightening experience. It makes the Reapers much more terrifying, and what they do all the more repulsive. One of the interesting things I noticed in these sections is how closely the Reapers and Grayson mirror Sam and Ryder. Similar language is used to describe these organic-synthetic pairs, with the main difference being Sam's programmed behavioral blocks that prioritize a symbiotic relationship with Ryder. The Reapers don't have these blocks. They are pure evil and believe themselves superior, so they express no remorse over subjugating Grayson's mind and body. It's frightening to consider how easy it could be for Sam to cross the line into Reaper territory, and it becomes even more of a concern after reading Mass Effect Initiation. The Reapers are also an interesting character in Retribution, one that I didn't expect to learn more about. There is an intriguing conversation Kahlee has with the Reaper-controlled Grayson, where they actually try to get her to understand their motives and goals. There are hints of the abandoned dark energy plot, and maybe even a different ending to the trilogy, but there are plenty of contradictions in it as well. It's convenient that the writers didn't know what the real motivation for the Reapers was at this point, because it just makes organics seem much more incapable of understanding the Reaper's true perspective. Thanks for watching. If you end up checking out Retribution, please leave a comment to let me know what you think, and be sure to put appropriate spoiler warnings for your discussion. If you have any questions about the story or characters, please also feel free to comment below, and I'll try to answer them or get around to them in a future video. If you liked this video, be on the lookout for my coverage of the other Mass Effect novels and comic books. I also have several theory videos coming, so stay tuned. Thanks again, and I'll see you in the next one.